In this message and the next, I'm going to suggest a way to address the claim there is no God and how to do it in a way that keeps people listening. I think the truth is that with 3 questions, we can show that it's far more reasonable to believe in God than to disbelieve. And the further truth is that almost anybody can do this with some coaching, with some maybe resources alongside, and with a bit of practice. And so this message and next week's message are intended to give some of that coaching. Some of the resources are in that handout that you received on the way in. The practice part, that's kind of up to you, but we hope that you'll invest in it because there's a clear connection between practice and confidence here. But throughout, and this is so important, friends, throughout, you got to remember that you don't have to persuade anybody of anything. I mean, ultimately, it's God who does the persuading. Ultimately, it's God who works in people's hearts, and we're simply the vehicle that he uses in that process. So really the pressure is off, right? We can just kind of sit back and listen and learn, and maybe keeping in mind a person or two with whom you'd like to engage on this topic. That could be really helpful to connect the dots, right? To make it more germane, to make it more relevant to you. Have somebody in mind, who can I talk to about this? Or maybe you're the skeptic in this, but that's a helpful way forward. Okay, so end of prefatory remarks. Let's see how God might use us to show skeptics that he is indeed real. Again, the skeptic's question, can you prove that God exists? And I'd suggest that the best answer to that question is not to answer, at least not immediately and at least not directly. Instead, maybe consider asking 3 questions that invite this person to offer his or her perspective. You might think about it as 3 conversations. 3 conversations that make it more of a dialogue than a debate, much more likely to make progress this way. Okay, what 3 questions can we ask? Well, they're the biggest questions that anybody can ask. Questions that everybody has thought about, questions that almost everybody recognizes as the ultimate questions in life. They happen to be, where did we come from? How should we live? And what happens after we die? Where did we come from? How should we live? What happens after we die? Just a few minor questions for our time this morning here. Right? But as we're going to see, each of these questions gets us to the deeper question, to the root question of whether there is a God. But it gets us there, they get us there indirectly, and they get us there collaboratively, and far less divisively than simply diving in to some sort of proof. And yes, we're going to incorporate some of those classic arguments for belief in God, but the place to start, I think, is with the other person's perspective, with the other person's experience. All right, and here's what I mean by that. So a friend or family member says something like, I'm just not sure I can believe there is a God. Or maybe more forcefully, Mike, there is no God. Or maybe more openly, they say something like, can you show me that God is even real? Or maybe you're the one who initiates that conversation. But however the door opens, a good way to walk through it is with this first question of where did we come from? But you may want to frame it a little bit differently. Perhaps something like this. They say there just can't be a God. Maybe you respond not with an answer, but with a question. Can I ask you for your perspective about something? Where do you think everything came from? The universe, the earth, people, plants, animals, you and me. Where did this all start? Where did this all come from? And notice, I'm not offering an answer to the question, is there a God? I'm simply asking a question, inviting them to go first. Okay? And hopefully they offer some sort of answer. And you listen charitably, empathetically, positive body language. All right, that's kind of important here because, frankly, this is not a cross-examination. And if we make it seem like that with our body language or with our tone, then this thing's going to be over before it even starts. All right, but let them talk for as long as they like. Don't interrupt, don't argue, don't disagree with anything. Why? Because inevitably, they're going to talk themselves into a bit of a dilemma. All right, almost guaranteed. All right, what dilemma? Ultimately, they have to get to a first cause of everything, right? We all would in this kind of conversation. And whatever they say that first cause is, either 1, that thing had to have always existed, or 2, it had to have been caused by something else, right? I'll say that again. Whatever they say the first cause is of everything, either that thing had to have always existed, or it had to have been caused or created by something else. Either way, they're going to run into a problem. And maybe here's where you can help. So let's say that, like many people, they'll cite something like the Big Bang. It all started with this Big Bang. Okay, well, fine. The universe had a starting point. Science, cosmology, puts that at about 14 billion years ago and has developed a pretty robust theory that the universe has always expanded from a single point in time and continues to expand. Now, what's the logical follow-up if somebody cites the Big Bang as the cause of everything? I'm asking rhetorically here, given our setting, but think about it. What might be a logical follow-up to that question? Maybe something like, all right, well, sounds plausible, but what do you think caused this Big Bang? All right, where did this matter or energy or whatever it was come from to set off this massive explosion? Now, again, there are only two options here, right? That stuff always existed, that explosive matter always existed, or it was created by something that always existed. Two and only two possibilities here. And here's the point. You want to ask, what is more reasonable to believe? And I think it's important, and I think it's wise to use that word reasonable as much as possible in this dialogue. What's more reasonable to believe? That there was uncreated explosive stuff that always existed, or there was a supreme being who always existed and made that explosive stuff to make the universe? Well, the first option, this stuff has been around for infinity years, is borderline absurd, and no rational person should believe that. However, the second option isn't all that satisfactory either, because none of us can say where this alleged supreme being came from. So where does that leave us? Well, it becomes a question of probability at this point, right? It becomes a question of what is more likely. Again, there was stuff that always existed and eventually blew up, or a supreme being who always existed. Which of those has the better chance of being true? Which of those is more reasonable? And personally, I think if you can get to this point in your conversation, you might want to just consider pausing it there and letting them contemplate it for themselves for a while. Why? Because by far, the more reasonable explanation is a supreme being. And some of the smartest people throughout history have reached this conclusion, whether it was Aristotle or whether it was Augustine or whether it was somebody like Thomas Aquinas or Rene Descartes, or any number of people throughout history have reached that conclusion. So chances are your friend might reach that conclusion as well once he or she reflects on it. And people are never more convinced of something than when they convince themselves. All right, so maybe that is a way forward. Besides, this first cause argument, as it's been called for centuries here, this first cause argument is really just a first crack at the question. There's much more, and for time's sake, we need to get to some of these other lines of argument. But before we do it, please see something. We Christians do not need to shy away from this theory of the Big Bang. We just don't. You see, this theory, it is not a threat to theism. It is not a threat to belief in God. In fact, it's a much greater threat to atheism, because it clearly implies a starting point for the universe, right? And a starting point requires a starter. All right, so the Big Bang works in our favor. So if we can get the conversation to that point, there's a clear line of sight to where we might want to go. Okay, so here's another way forward, also in response to this question, where did we come from? You might be able to add to your conversation the emerging scientific evidence that the universe was specifically and intentionally designed for life. This is becoming nearly irrefutable. But word of caution here, unless you have some sort of expertise in astrophysics, you might want to bring alongside some resources, a user-friendly video, plain English article. There's some stuff like that in that resources page there, and there's much more out there. But the gist of the argument, quoting from some of the real experts, and by the way, technically it's called the fine-tuning of the universe argument, as you see there. Here's the gist of the argument from 4 experts. First, this guy, Francis Collins, and you might recognize this name. He's former director of the NIH, scientist, was on TV a lot during COVID. And Collins says this. He says there are 15 constants that have precise values. If any one of those constants was off by 1 part in a million, or in some cases 1 part in a million, matter would not have been able to coalesce. There would have been no galaxy, no stars, no people. Now, what Collins is talking about here are constants like the strength of gravity, or the weight of an electron, or the expansion rate of the universe, or other kinds of heady stuff that's way beyond most of us. But these are the conditions for life to exist. And if any of them were different by the tiniest fraction, then science tells us that life would not exist anywhere. Okay, next expert, a guy named Paul Davies, internationally acclaimed physicist and cosmologist. Actually, this guy is so famous in the field that they named an asteroid after him. All right, so how'd you like that on your resume? That'd be pretty cool. Davies says this. Scientists are slowly waking up to an inconvenient truth. The universe looks suspiciously like a fix. For 40 years, physicists and cosmologists have been quietly collecting examples of all too convenient coincidences that seem to be necessary in order for life, and hence conscious beings, to exist. Change any one of them, and the consequences would be lethal. Right? All too convenient coincidences. This is the same thing as Collins was talking about with those 15 constants. Next expert, Fred Hoyle, Cambridge University in England. This guy is the originator of the term Big Bang. So we're bringing out the real heavy hitters here for these quotes. Hoyle says that a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. That is the conclusion that a super intellect is behind it all. And even Hoyle's more famous Cambridge colleague, physicist Stephen Hawking, which is a name some of you might be familiar with, a celebrated atheist, admitted this. So this is from Hawking. He says, the remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers, again, these constants that Collins was talking about, these all too convenient coincidences that Davies was talking about, the remarkable fact is the values of these numbers seem to have been finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. The point. The likelihood of this perfect storm of parameters coming together by chance is as close to zero as a number can get. And far more reasonable, and there's that word again, the far more reasonable explanation is that it all came together by design. And a design requires a designer. Okay? Again, the official name for this is the fine-tuning argument because of how precisely fine-tuned the universe is for life to exist. Also called the argument from design. It's also connected to this theory of intelligent design, which is a term you may have heard along the way. And yeah, the details of fine-tuning are really complex, but they're stunning. And the theory is getting plenty of traction in the scientific community. And folks, that's the kind of credibility that you can bring to this conversation. All right? Your skeptical friend, your skeptical family member is not likely to be impressed by the Bible says, right? It's just not credible to them. They're not likely to be impressed by the Bible says. They're much more likely to be impressed by the science says. So give it to them. Increasingly, the science of the universe is on the side of theism. Okay. We suggested structuring this dialogue around 3 questions, or at least organizing our thinking this way. That was question 1, where did we come from? The answers from this first cause argument, as well as this fine-tuning argument, point to the reasonableness of believing in God. That's our claim so far. And that'll be true for this second question as well. Conversation about how should we live. Now consider this. Many people who are skeptical about whether God exists still tend to have pretty strong convictions about how we should live, about how the world should be, about what's right and what's wrong. Now, what's the problem with that? Let's find out. So what would happen if you asked your conversation partner a question like this? So from your perspective, are there people in the world who are doing things that are wrong and that they should definitely stop doing? From your perspective, are there things that people are doing out there that are wrong they should definitely stop doing? Now, who's going to say no to that? Right? No, nothing wrong in the world. Everything is just as it should be. Now, it's preposterous. Chances are your friend's going to have plenty to say about people behaving badly, about people behaving illegally, immorally, unjustly. But when they do, they'll actually find themselves on the horns of another dilemma. Well, what dilemma this time? See, no matter what misbehavior they cite, you can follow up by saying, yes, I agree. And why is that wrong? Yes, I agree. And why is that wrong? They'll probably think the answer is obvious, but no matter how they answer, they're actually going to show that there must be a God for their perspective to be valid, or they'll show that their perspective is merely a subjective opinion. That's the dilemma for the skeptic. There must be a God, or my opinion is subjective. But that's a bit abstract, so let me make it more concrete here. So you ask for an example of something that is wrong in the world. And they say something like genocide or terrorism or child molestation or human trafficking or racism or whatever they say. Your response, yes, I agree. And why is that wrong? Well, now, don't miss this. Unless they point to some sort of supreme lawgiver who determines moral behavior for all people at all times, well, then their answer to why is that wrong has to be subjective. In other words, it has to be based on merely personal opinion or societal norms. So why is genocide wrong? Well, everybody knows that it's wrong. Actually, that's a subjective opinion. Everybody doesn't know that it's wrong, otherwise it wouldn't exist. It wouldn't happen. So why is genocide wrong? Well, it's illegal. Actually, the law is subjective too, in the sense that it's based on societal norms at the time. It's been different in other times in different places. Might be different in the future. So why is genocide wrong? Well, because it harms people, and obviously harming people is wrong. Well, you see, even that is subjective. What if there's somebody else out there who doesn't think that harming people is wrong? So is there any objective, unchanging, immovable basis for us saying that genocide is wrong, or that anything is wrong for that matter? Not without an ultimate authority, not without a supreme lawgiver. In other words, not without God. So you can consider something from everyday life, and you'll get to the same result. You're in line at the coffee shop. Somebody cuts in front of you in line. That's not right. That's not fair. Well, says who? Well, everybody knows you don't cut in line. Go wait your turn. Well, no, I don't know that. In fact, in my culture, we cut in line all the time. Besides, I'm in a hurry. What? You see, no ultimate authority, no moral standards that apply to everyone. No God, no basis for right and wrong. So to this question of how should we live, you can only say that we should live in a particular way if you agree that there is a supreme lawgiver. Okay, this is called the moral standards argument for the existence of God, or the argument from morality. It's been around for a very long time. Immanuel Kant, maybe a name you've heard of, maybe the most famous, celebrated philosopher in the last 1,000 years, made this argument so eloquently, so powerfully. And C.S. Lewis popularized this argument in his book, Mere Christianity. Any Mere Christianity fans here? Maybe if you've not read Mere Christianity, put it on your summer reading list. Amen, Pastor? Small book, disproportionately profound. Here's an excerpt from the book on this question of morality. Lewis says this. He says, the moment you say that one set of moral ideals can be better than another, in other words, no genocide is better than genocide, or waiting your turn is better than cutting in line. The moment you say that one set of moral ideals can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by some standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other. You are, in fact, comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is such a thing as real right, independent of what people think. Now, notice the capitalization in that quote, and you understand that C.S. Lewis is talking about God as that real morality, as that real right. And his point is that we can't claim that something is moral or immoral, right or wrong, for all people at all times, across all cultures, unless we recognize that there's a higher authority than what people think. And frankly, true atheists fully recognize the validity of this argument. To be consistent, they have to contend that there's no real right and wrong in the world. Richard Dawkins, maybe the most famous atheist on the planet today, said this quite directly. He said, the universe we observe has no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Wow. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. It's actually an echo of Friedrich Nietzsche from 150 years ago of God is dead fame. And Nietzsche insisted that if there is no God, in other words, if God is dead, then the idea of morality is completely baseless, merely subjective. No reason to be kind to anyone or even civil. No reason to care about others, no reason to work for justice, no basis for any human rights. It's horrifying, isn't it? I heard this news story the other day of parents who were on trial for starving their 2 young boys. And when police found the 7-year-old, he was in critical condition. The 6-year-old had already passed away. The 6-year-old weighed only 18 pounds. And these boys were locked in a closet for 16 hours a day because they tried to steal food when their parents were asleep. Now, why am I telling you this story? Notice that an atheist can't even call that behavior wrong. Why? Because there's no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference in the universe. And I suspect that many people who think of themselves as atheists really have no idea the monstrous implications of that worldview. Again, this is the moral standards argument, or the argument for morality. You can dig in deeper in those resources on your handout. But please don't miss the larger point here. Right? All this falls under this general question of how should we live? And the only way to have a rational, defensible answer to that is to agree that a supreme being is there who determines right and wrong. Okay, let me offer one more approach under this heading of how we should live, and we could do this in 2 minutes, 3 minutes tops. Dates back to the 17th century and a Christian mathematician and philosopher named Blaise Pascal. Again, maybe a name that you've heard of somewhere. In simple terms, Pascal claimed that how we live is basically a bet, B-E-T. Right? Whether you believe in God or don't believe in God, you're betting whether God is real. Okay? And like any bet, there are payouts and there are punishments. And so looks something like this. Now, this looks like a lot, but trust me, it's actually quite easy to understand. So starting on the left side of this matrix over here, this is the bet part, and on the top, that's the outcome, what happens if you're right, what happens if you're wrong. Okay, so Pascal said that everybody bets on whether God exists. And in this top row here, if you believe in God and live if he does exist, and you're right about that, well, then you get eternal joy after you die. Now, I recognize that might not be your theology, but stay with me here, right? If you're right about that, you get eternal joy. If you're wrong, you believe in God, but actually God doesn't exist, you lose nothing. Okay? On the bottom row, let's say that you bet that God does not exist, and you live according to that. This is the atheist, this is the lifelong agnostic, right? So if you are an atheist and you're correct about that, you gain nothing, Pascal said. But if you're wrong, right, after you die, plot twist, God is real, you get eternal suffering. Okay? So, in practical terms, according to Pascal, this is a ridiculously risky bet to live as if God doesn't exist. The risks of atheism far outweigh any possible temporal reward. The safer and wiser bet, claimed Blaise Pascal, is to follow God. Now, of course, there are plenty of objections to this approach, and maybe you have some as well. Plus, Pascal's wager, as it's called here, does not attempt to prove the existence of God, but it does show the reasonableness of believing that there is a God. And you may have some people around you with whom this will resonate, who might find this line of argument compelling. All right? It's not a first line of argument for us, but maybe keep this one in your toolkit for the right person. Okay, so we're coming to the end for today at least, so let me offer a quick recap. When addressing the issue of whether God is real, we said it might be wiser to ask questions before giving answers, right? Make it into a respectful conversation, a dialogue, rather than a debate. Asking questions like, where did we come from? How should we live? What happens to us after we die? And we covered 2 of those 3 questions today, focusing, notice, on logical and scientific answers. We're not giving Bible-based answers here. Not because there aren't Bible-based answers, but your conversation partner does not find that to be credible, right? So we need to look at it through his or her lens, through the lens of logic, or through the lens of science, through the lens of reasonableness, right? But, and here's where we're going with this. What if someone's not all that impressed by fancy philosophical arguments and large numbers and probabilities? Right? Or what if it's all just sort of too confusing for them, and so these answers we've discussed so far kind of fall flat? Maybe that's the person that you're thinking about. Or maybe that's you, right? Maybe you've just heard all this and you're kind of skeptical, shrugging your shoulders. Yeah, what else you got, pastor or professor or whatever you are up there? Well, is there another way to look at this question of God's existence that goes beyond philosophy and goes beyond physics? It might be even more compelling to some. I think the answer to that is yes, and that's where we'll be picking up next time with our third question that can lead to belief in God, this question of what happens to us after we die.